Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the October 3rd Thursday Web Forum. My name's Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint user support and communications for your cooperative. The South Atlantic LCC hosts this Web Forum every third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m., and it serves as a chance for you to ask questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of the South Atlantic. So we follow roughly the same agenda in each of these webinars. I'll start out by introducing our presenter, and following a 30 to 40-minute presentation, we'll have time for questions, and then we'll spend the rest of the webinar on updates from LCC staff, followed by an open discussion. So before I hand things off to Rua, I want to go over the usual logistics. To minimize background noise, I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone during the presentation by putting us in silent mode. So if you have any questions, you can either type them directly into the chat box, which I'll be monitoring, or you can just hold them until after the presentation. And if you do use the chat box and want everyone to be able to read your question, just remember to send the note to everyone by selecting that from the little drop-down box in that menu. And to speak up at any time, all you have to do is press *6 to unmute yourself. So before I mute everybody, does anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns? All right.
The conference is now in silent mode.
So presenting today we have Rua Mordecai, who, as most of you probably know, is the science coordinator for the South Atlantic LCC, and he's going to talk to us about his work modeling the impacts of longleaf pine management on water availability. So Rua, I'm going to pass presenter power over to you to get us started, and just remember *6 to unmute your line.
All right, excellent. Can you hear me all right?
Sure can.
Cool. All right. I'm going to get fancy. I'm going to turn my little video on too. All right. So give me a second here. Share some screen action. Get this started. All right. So as Hillary said, going to be talking about some work that I've been doing, modeling some potential increased water availability from prescribed fire in the Longleaf system. First question is, why am I working on this at all? So a big focus for your cooperative this year has been particularly around figuring out how to support Blueprint users and implement the conservation blueprint for the South Atlantic. And a big focus has been making proposals more competitive for national funding, growing the pie that we have here, using the relationships and the blueprint and the data we have to try to bring some additional resources. So that's one of the big focuses here. And one of the things that happened a lot is going through most of these funding sources, whether they're land water conservation funds or funds related to the Gulf of Mexico, or almost every acquisition or management related funding source so far has been asking for impacts of water and watershed impacts. And that even includes the Fire Resilient Landscapes Initiative. And so this section, particularly when we start talking about prescribed fire, but even other actions, this section of proposals has been the one that Blueprint users are finding the hardest to actually fill out and quantify, especially when we're talking about sort of parcel level impacts. First question you might have is, how can prescribed fire increase available water? Well, luckily the concept is actually pretty simple. So what happens when you have regular fire in your longleaf system? Of course, that fire is reducing the overall leaf area of your system. So think this is a little piece of a picture pulled out of the, say, South Atlantic assessment. So on the left, thinking about something that hasn't been burned for a while, you have all that understory component that's thickened up, and then on the right, after you have fire and a number of years afterwards, you've really reduced a lot of the overall area of leaves that's in there. And less leaf area means less water lost to evapotranspiration. So basically you have less leaves out there and less understory that's sending water right back into the air. That means the ecosystem has more water to be used. Now, it gets a little trickier when you want to try to figure out, well, exactly how much of that water has been lost to evapotranspiration, and then particularly, okay, you have extra water, where does it go next? And that depends on a number of other things. But we're going to start with just the basic water yield pieces without going into the runoff and the other pieces just yet. All right, so that's the basic idea. You've got more vegetation, more leaf area if you don't burn something for a while, and that means more water loss. Now, thinking about this at a national scale and thinking about potentially how much of that water yield could change based on changes in leaf area index. This is a map showing results from the WASI model, the Water Supply Stress Index Ecosystem Services model that's done by the Forest Service. And what this is basically showing you is potential change in water yield with a 50% reduction in leaf area index. So red is your highest values, blue are your lowest values. And so that's showing it in sort of millimeters per year of water yield. And what should immediately jump out at you if you're thinking about, particularly about prescribed fire and water markets, is that there is a huge potential for big numbers of water savings in the South and in the South Atlantic compared to pretty much the rest of the country. We have a lot of areas that need regular management that are overgrown, especially in the Longleaf system. And we're also in this big hotspot where potential changes could mean a lot of water, especially when we're talking about competing with fire dollars for projects out west, which, as you see, are mostly predicting very small changes in water yield. And the other interesting and / good news is that this was a 50% reduction in leaf area index, and data from Florida suggests that regular fire can actually reduce that longleaf leaf area index by pretty close to 50% at that point. So this is actually not too bad of a first cut on what could happen. So there's data I'm pulling from stuff actually near Itchaway and some sandhills longleaf. I'm going to use those data again in a second in my example. All right, so now to a specific example. So these calculations depend on climate predictions and other things, so I had to pick a specific place. So what we'll do is we'll pick a specific example, and let's say we want to look at 100 acres of longleaf getting regularly burned in Liberty County, Florida. So this is right around the Apalachicola National Forest area, and as you can see, I've overlaid the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint version 2.0 on this. So the white outline you see down near the Panhandle of Florida is Liberty County, and basically all of this is a priority at some level in the Conservation Blueprint. So the darker levels are your high and highest. That lighter pink is your medium, and then the gray are the corridors. So this is all very important blueprint areas here. So grab that county as an example, pulled some data on potential evapotranspiration, so that's for June, and then also precipitation for June. So in this example, I'm just going to look at the month of June. Things varied depending on months. For you data nerds, that's the potential evapotranspiration is from MODIS, precipitation is from PRISM. All right. Now, estimating water yield. So using some of that climate from Liberty County, Florida, again focusing on June, and then pulling some data on change in leaf area index based on fire in Florida sandhills longleaf. So the comparison here is going to be between longleaf burned within about 6 years versus stands that have gone 10 plus years without fire. So that's the comparison we had going to be using in this example. And so the water yield predicted for 100 acres in June ends up being about 850,000 gallons of additional water due to that prescribed fire. And here's a confidence interval too as well. So you're going between about 650,000 to about 1 million gallons of water change in water yield predicted. So this is basic kind of water balance equation stuff, well founded in the literature for quite a while here. So that actually kind of gives you a sense of potential scale of how much actually additional water could be coming from this prescribed fire, and could actually form a fairly compelling basis, especially in these national proposals, for us to start predicting, well, how much increased water yield are we getting due to our management actions. So very cool stuff. Known issues so far. The first thing, right now, I only have leaf area index comparisons, the LAI comparisons, based on burn history in Florida sandhills longleaf. Like I mentioned before, in Itchaway, it's kind of around Central Florida. And of course, things like leaf area index, they vary regionally across longleaf types in the South Atlantic. So that's obviously a little different in Liberty County, a little bit different up in North Carolina on the coast versus interior sandhills. The good news is that the model predicting change in water yield isn't sensitive to the initial leaf area index within typical values for longleaf. So basically, it's about 1.05 leaf area index for that example that we're using. But within typical ranges, because I'm calculating the difference in water yield, it doesn't really matter if you start from a leaf area index of 1.03 or, on the more extreme case, something closer to 2 that you might find in other longleaf systems. So within that normal range, modeling results aren't really that sensitive. Bad news is that the percent change in leaf area index, there may be some differences in how these ecosystems respond to fire in different longleaf types. Unfortunately, right now, I haven't been able to find data within the same longleaf system comparing plots that have been not burned for a long time versus regularly burned. So consider this another request. We sent one out in the newsletter, so if anyone on the line, if you have some data on leaf area, know some folks that have leaf area index data in other spots for longleaf, especially if we've got kind of unburned versus regularly burned stuff, that would be great. Could be really helpful in improving some of these predictions. So, known issues so far. The other thing, still refining some of the uncertainty measures. I did fairly quick and dirty kind of uncertainty in that in those estimates. So the confidence intervals might change a little bit. They're probably pretty close, but did a fairly quick and dirty incorporation of the uncertainty in the numbers that I just showed you. All right, so next steps for the water yield piece, working on developing some GIS layers for the entire South Atlantic to predict potential change in water yield per acre. So essentially some measures where you could go into whatever region you're looking at and have some predictions of how much water yield per acre would happen depending on your location. So it would be more of a raster kind of data set that you could grab and use it for whatever region you are interested in. So I'm working on developing those. And the other big next step is the even trickier one, which is, okay, where does the water go next? We've yielded this additional water, right? So we've got those, in June, for the month of June, 850,000 more gallons of water there. But the next and tricky question is, well, what happens next? How much of it is going off under surface runoff, subsurface runoff? How much is going into groundwater? How much is staying in the soil? So that's the trickier part that I'm kind of in the midst of working on right now. So we've got the evaporation, transpiration component of this whole water cycle, precipitation, but then bringing in the soils and hydrology and other pieces about what happens next to the water is what I'm working on right now. So I've been exploring a few different modeling frameworks, OpenInspect from NOAA Coastal Services Center, HECRAS, which is an Army Corps model, and then also SWAT comes from USDA and Texas A&M. All of them have their strengths and weaknesses, and I'm also looking at some hybridization with some waterfall in-stream flow models we have for the entire South Atlantic at the catchment level to start looking at handoffs between runoff and in-stream flow that incorporate things like water withdrawals and returns and other components. So this is when it gets tricky. This is some of the pieces are still very much in the works. So that's a few models we're trying to work on and kind of what happens to the water next. A few other things in development right now, also working on the impact of other conservation actions in water. So one thing I've got an initial example running right now is the effect of land protection on water quality and quantity. So I've got some models running on OpenInspect in South Carolina and a South Carolina watershed that predicts potential changes in runoff, nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment due to parcel level land protection. I really wanted to show you a picture, but unfortunately it's part of a current LWCF proposal that's going in, so I couldn't share the nice pretty picture of here's the parcel and here's the map of how far those impacts go and what it does to nitrogen concentrations, etc. So I was about to put this in the slide and I was like, oh wait, I can't do that. So that's one thing. I've got that model running, working on setting that up so we can run that anywhere in the South Atlantic to support potential blueprint users that are looking at proposing land protection. Also in the midst of looking at the impact of riparian restoration and water quality and quantity. So I've got an initial test project that's actually one in Florida that's a riparian restoration project that the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership, SARP, has funded. So I'm working on running some of that and predicting that impact of riparian restoration. And then the last one, which is still under investigation, but also has some pretty exciting potential as well, is looking at the impact of invasive species removal on water quality and quantity. So what does that actually do, and how does that change the overall water balance and where water goes? So those are the big in-development actions that are underway right now. So that is my quick update on progress so far on modeling some of these impacts of fire on water quantity, but then also taking it to the next level of where does the water go, and then also some other impacts of other conservation actions on water. So at this point, open it up to questions.
Yeah, thanks, Rua. Plenty of time for questions. Just remember *6 to unmute if you want to speak up, or feel free to use the chat box.
Hi, Rua. This is Cheryl Millett from Florida.
Hey, Cheryl. How you doing?
Good. I'm really excited about this this information, and especially that you said that you have it for all of Florida. Is that something that I could easily get from you?
Yeah, I'll share. Just have to run. So I did that as an example county. I've just got to do some calculations, some GIS stuff. I have the underlying layers I need to do it. I just need to do some processing, and I'd be glad to get that to you. I'll probably get it up on our conservation planning atlas as well. So yeah, glad to share it. Okay,
cool. And I also had well, I was just wondering, when you're trying to do the modeling, where does the water go? Is that something that the water management districts would have worked on? It seems like that would be up their alley.
Yeah, it actually. I've been collaborating with a few different people and hydrologists throughout the South Atlantic, and actually one of them is one of the hydrologists from the St. John's Water Management District. There's been some really great stuff on slash pine and some fairly focused pieces. So I'm actually, now that I've made a little more progress, we're going to get back together with him and talk about that question as well. So yeah, that's really. He was very excited about moving that way on Longleaf, and that is something that I'm going to be catching back up with a few of the Water Management District folks on to see what they have as well.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I'm hoping some of these are already, especially when they're already parameterized, like same thing with some of the Army Corps models. If we already have one bring in reservoir flows and all the obstructions, and we've kind of pulled them in, we already have them populated and they're already being used in practice for water decisions. It's, much smoother to use those existing models with just, tweaks to the values than do something different.
Yeah, I'm also curious about the invasive species removal question. And it's going to vary by the invasive species, I would imagine.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's a really complicated one.
Yeah, and a lot of it really just depends on what data are already out there. It's just kind of sensitive to, if people have done some good publications on that given species or a collection of a couple species and have done some of the hydrology stuff, then it's not so hard to bring into the models at that course level. But yeah, if no one's done the studies on them, then it's tough. Then it's more complicated. Right. But you can imagine just thinking about, some of these species like, kogan grass and other things, once they invade the system, you've got a pretty big difference in that overall vegetation area that's invaded that should make it through the system. And there's pretty good grounding for a lot of these invasions using significantly more water. It's just a matter of, can we get the data on a specific species?
Right, and I would imagine for some species like that, it is going to be a lot clearer than it may be for some others that that don't fill in all available space quite as much. Yeah,
exactly. But I think that'll be the interesting, being able to get it for one invasion, just at least at a simplified level. But then, if we have some rough estimates of sort of multi-species invasions, because they kind of fill in different niches and pieces, that might be an even more. Then that could also add up. So it kind of be an interesting, nuanced way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Cheryl. We have a question from the chat box from Ryan Boyles. Could similar analysis be done at a daily or weekly time step? It would be especially worthwhile to look at changes in water availability during very dry periods as a potential way to show the benefits and costs of management during drought.
That's exactly what I was thinking about, Ryan. That's the really kind of the interesting piece of, thinking about choke points and where that water matters, especially when you think about where the water goes. So there's, ideally, there's no reason why I can't do that at daily. I just did it at monthly because it was a little bit faster for processing the data, but I've got all the scripts kind of written up in R, so it's more of just a matter of processing it. I think the daily one, especially when you're thinking about drought, is more interesting because then you think about drought resilience, in the system and whether you've crossed some thresholds. Then it's really the daily precipitations that make a lot of sense. So yeah, definitely a daily. And then also it's very straightforward to then incorporate future climate scenarios into this as well. Basically pulling in changes in temperature and changes in precipitation and thinking about, okay, how resilient is this to drought during current conditions, and how resilient is it under some different climate change scenarios. So it's pretty straightforward to do that as well.
Awesome. Anybody else have a question? We have plenty of time.
I think Jason had his hand up.
It was like
earlier.
A quick up and down. You have a question, Jason?
Okay, never mind. All right, I won't call you out of here.
Don't be shy.
And you can *6 to unmute if you're going to talk. I always forget. I have to write it down on my little piece of paper, the *6 thing.
Well, this is Cheryl again, because there's a question that a lot of us working on Longleaf have talked about, and it's whether it matters that your stand is Longleaf, or if it could be, sparsely populated slash pine. And I know Longleaf is supposed to be using less water than slash pine, but it really, how good is the evidence for that?
That's a good question. I haven't looked too deep on the difference, because it interacts with how sparsely, if you have the same densities of longleaf and slash pine compared. So, obviously if you have less slash pine versus a little more longleaf, then that interacts as well. Each of them respond differently. They have different sort of leaf area index components. But yeah, I haven't really, in practice, whether how different a slash pine in practice looks to a longleaf when you balance out water use for an individual species versus stocking density. I haven't looked into that in too much detail. Okay. I would imagine, at least from everything I've seen, that it would probably use more the slash pine if it was the exact same sort of leaf area and stocking density, but I'm not sure how much that is in practice. So I think it's a good question. The other thing that I didn't run, which is the kind of off the charts water, is you compare leaf area index to a pine plantation, a loblolly pine plantation, compared to regularly burned longleaf. It's probably at least 3 to 4 orders of magnitude bigger. So that number is much bigger than what I just showed.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing on management perspective that I didn't mention in here, but just sort of looking at overall kind of densities of longleaf within a stand and how that interacts to affect surrounding isolated wetlands and water demand as well. So it looked into that a little bit as well.
Cool. Thanks.
All right, Jason did have a question. So, Jason, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's try this again. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
I was double muted. I had my headset on mute and the *6.
Oh, no.
All right. So, all right, good. So, hey, Rua, great presentation. And my question, this may be, pardon the pun, a little down in the weeds, but I was thinking about ways to get more LAI data in the field, and didn't know if you had a chance also to look into some of the different options. From what little work that I've looked into, looks like there's a pretty good range in terms of the cost. Like the LICOR instrument, I think they wanted something like $20,000 versus like Decagon has something that's, maybe $2,000 or $3,000. I can't remember offhand, but just thinking about ways to try to get some more of this information from, while we're already out in the field collecting other data sets. And, any thoughts? And maybe also on that, it seems like one important component could be how the data is collected as well. In other words, in an unburned area where you've got maybe more shrubs encroaching, if you're getting the measurement at the proper height or something like that to capture some of that increased leaf area index. So just any thoughts on that, or anything that you've maybe had a chance to dig into would be great to hear.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And so much of this stuff has been more remote sensing based and then validated by some of the ground pieces. I haven't dug too much into the recent instrumentation stuff, but I think that's an excellent point and probably good for follow-up with a few other folks that have done some leaf area index in pine. There's been some long-term work across the Gulf and Longleaf in general that are kind of more natural stands, regularly burned, that have been collecting some leaf area index. I think might be good for following up with a few other folks and see if we can get some more recent recommendations. Just from a kind of a best practices perspective for additional data, because that's a great point, especially when you're collecting data in the field. How you're picking your points, where you're sampling, instruments could have a huge impact on the results.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Ryan's chiming in with some thoughts on the equipment y'all were talking about. The Lycor probe is high-end, he says, and made to stay within calibration a longer time, while the Decagon probe needs to be calibrated more frequently, about every year or so.
Thanks, Ryan.
Nice to have a ex-state climatologist, now deputy coordinator of the Climate Science Center, to weigh in on some of the climate parameters.
Yeah, what are you, like a, state climatologist emeritus? I don't know what you call that.
I like that title.
Yeah.
Can we call you that, Ryan?
All right. He says just a wannabe. Anybody else have questions? This is great discussion.
Yeah, that's actually good. I was thinking about that might be something could be good with some of the folks from the Southern Research Station, because I know a lot of the ecophysiology folks have had a lot of experiment with some of the instrumentation and have done some transpiration and used a lot of the equipment. That might be something I'd follow up with some folks there. Taking a note.
All right, well, we're getting kind of quiet. I'm going to pause one more time, see if anybody else wants to chime in. All right, well, I'll go ahead and continue with some staff updates, and then we can circle back to questions at the end if anybody has anything that comes to them in the next couple minutes. I would definitely encourage you to stick around just for two quick updates from your South Atlantic staff that I think may be of interest to folks on the line. First is that the most updated version of the Blueprint 2.1, is now available in the Simple Viewer. So now when you go to the Simple Viewer to explore the Blueprint, you will see the most updated version. I should have put the URL on here, but it's blueprint.southatlanticlcc.org, and you can get to the Simple Viewer from our website. So definitely check out the latest and greatest version of the Blueprint in the Simple Viewer. Until now, it's just been up on the Conservation Planning Atlas. So I also wanted to highlight that at the Seattle conference earlier this week in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, there was a leadership summit for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or CCAS, and so I wanted to give Mallory the chance to give us a quick synopsis of that. Mallory, *6.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Loud and clear.
Good. Okay, well, this is Mallory, and thanks for that. Just wanted to say that on Monday of this week, there was a leadership summit that was convened at the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies meeting down in Baton Rouge. And that leadership summit focused on the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or CCAS. and featured also the release of the CCAS Blueprint version 1.0, which is a map of shared conservation and restoration priorities across the Southeast and the Caribbean. So basically the Blueprint 1.0 for the CCAS stitches together conservation planning efforts of 6 LCCs across the 15-state CAFWA region. And I think the blueprint itself and the updates that were provided as part of that during the summit were very well received by the Southeastern Association directors and also the federal principals of the federal resource management agencies in that same geography. And in fact, in the business meeting for the Southeastern directors on Tuesday of this week, they voted to affirm their support for this CCAS initiative and looked forward to another 5 years of effort and accomplishment in promoting conservation and restoration activities across this geography. So we were really happy to be a part of that. Rua presented on the CCAS blueprint, which you're seeing an image of there on the screen, and we were also involved in the prep and the lead-up and agenda preparation for that meeting. We're very satisfied with those outcomes. So that's basically an update on that, and I think you should be able to access that CCAS blueprint on the CCAS website, which is ccassoutheast.org. And if that blueprint's not up now, it should be up soon in the next couple of days.
Thanks, Mallory. We can pause at the end, too, if anyone has any questions about CCAS. So I want to preview next month's Third Thursday Web Forum. Might be appealing to a slightly different audience. We're moving from the Longleaf system to the open ocean in the South Atlantic region. But the next Web Forum is going to be on November 17th, same time, same connection info as today. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Tom Oakey with the University of Victoria. He's going to be updating us on the progress of a South Atlantic LCC-funded project to develop an integrated ecosystem model of the marine environment in the South Atlantic. So we know the marine ecosystem in the South Atlantic region is changing. We're facing things like climate change and changes in ocean variability. There's fishing pressure. There's watershed changes. There's pollution and habitat changes, et cetera. But of course, the marine ecosystem is also influenced by coastal and marine resource policy and strategies. So ecosystem modeling for the marine environment has really improved a lot in the last 15 years since the initial South Atlantic Bight ecosystem model was constructed. And even at that time, it was suggested that U.S. fisheries management should incorporate that model. And now, while it's increasingly common in research to use these types of ecosystem models, embracing those models in management has been a little slower in coming. So now that we've really advanced in our ecosystem modeling approaches and the availability of improved data on fisheries and oceanographic features and estuaries, we now have the ingredients for developing a much more sophisticated ecosystem model that should be very useful to managers. So in next month's presentation, Dr. Oakey is going to be describing the EcoPath and EcoSim model of the South Atlantic region. He'll review the history of the development of those models, describe some of the new key developments of the approach, like advancements in ecospace, and describe how efforts within that model will interface with other approaches and data and teams to advance overall the ecosystem modeling capabilities for the region and the marine environment. So the hope here is that the efforts of this broader collaborative team, which again is supported through the South Atlantic LCC, will really advance the modeling tools that are available for the marine ecosystem in this region. So I think that's going to be a really interesting talk. And then finally, I always wrap up with this slide just so folks know how they can get involved in the cooperative. If you're new, please contact staff like me, like Rua, like Mallory, or talk to anybody else who's been involved in the cooperative directly. I'd really encourage you to join the website. That'll get you signed up for our monthly newsletter where you can learn about upcoming projects, opportunities to serve on teams, and how to access all the great spatial data that we've been talking about, including, of course, the blueprint. So with that, I'll open the floor for any additional questions folks might have before we sign off. Questions about CCAS, more questions about Longleaf. Just *6 to unmute.
This is Rua. I'll just add one more thing about the next web forum being talking about the marine environment. But from a long-term perspective, one of the things we're actually working on with these, water quantity and quality models is actually making that full-on connection between management of things like prescribed fire in Longleaf and how is that affecting the nearshore and sort of marine ecosystem. So even drawing that connection of what does that mean for water quality and quantity, and how does that then flow down into the marine ecosystem and then affect and change those pieces. So trying to eventually make these full system connections that in the future, hopefully being able to make some even compelling arguments about how fire is improving oysters and forage fish and things like that in the nearshore and the estuaries and the marine. So they're not as disconnected as you might think.
Yeah, good point. Thanks. All right, well, hearing no more questions, that's really all we have. Ending pretty early today, 10:38, so enjoy your free 22 minutes before your 11 o'clock call or whatever meeting you have scheduled next. Thanks so much, Rua, for presenting, and really appreciate everybody tuning in today. Hope you'll join us next month.